It's strange how silence can echo louder than gunfire. I remember the winter of '42, stationed up near Halifax, when the wind off the Atlantic cut so deep it made the bones ache. We used to joke that the cold was our first enemy and the boredom our second. Canada was alive with fear back then. Maps covered in red arrows, rumors about U-boats slipping past the coast, whispers that German bombers could reach as far as Montreal or Toronto. We believed it. Everyone. So they built batteries along the shoreline, concrete nests for anti-aircraft guns that pointed to a sky that never darkened. I stood there once beside a Bofors, its barrel wrapped in frost, the steel glinting faintly under a pale morning sun. We trained for hours, tracking imaginary planes, our hands numb on the cranks. The sergeant barked orders, as if the enemy might appear any second, but the horizon stayed empty, blue and endless, mocking our readiness. Years later, when I heard that some of those same guns had been turned into playground equipment, I couldn't decide whether to laugh or cry, maybe both. The war had ended, and the weapons that once embodied dread were now painted bright colors and filled with laughter. It felt poetic in a way, as if the land itself had decided to heal. The men who watched those skies weren't born soldiers. Most of them had been farmhands, mechanics, fishermen, the kind of people who'd spent their lives reading weather instead of war. They were patient, steady, used to waiting, and waiting became their war. That's what people forget. There's a different kind of battle in standing guard against something that never comes. You begin to doubt yourself, then your orders, then even the reason you're there. You wonder if maybe you're a fool, pointing a cannon at clouds while the real fight rages oceans away. Some of the Canadians told me they envied the men who went overseas, said at least they'd get to do something. But when the war finally ended, I think some of them realized they'd been lucky. They'd faced the enemy of uncertainty, and that one leaves marks too, even if no bullets ever fly. I met a man years later, a gunner from Prince Edward Island, who told me he still woke up sometimes expecting the sirens. "It's not the sound you remember," he said. "It's the waiting, the quiet before what never comes." After the surrender, the world was desperate to bury the memory of steel. The factories that once roared with production now hummed with reconstruction. Soldiers came home to build playgrounds, schools, and homes instead of bunkers. But in some places, the ghosts of the war lingered in metal form, those silent Bofors and Oerlikons, left to rust on forgotten corners of airfields and docks. Someone, somewhere, must have looked at one and thought, why not? They stripped out the machinery, sanded the edges, painted them red, blue, yellow. They anchored them into parks where children could climb, spin the old gun wheels, and pretend they were flying planes. I saw one once, outside Winnipeg, the base still original, the barrel repurposed into a slide. The paint was peeling, revealing the dull grey of its past life. Kids shouted and laughed, their voices carrying through the air where gunners once strained to hear engines. I stood there for a long time, feeling the kind of ache you can't quite name, the kind that mixes pride and sorrow in equal measure. Those guns had never fired in anger, but they'd lived long enough to see joy. That's a rare fate for any weapon. When I think back on those days, I can still smell the grease and hear the click of gears locking in place. The air always tasted faintly of metal. We believed we were ready for the worst, but no one tells you how heavy it feels to prepare for something that never happened. Readiness becomes its own prison. Every sound becomes a maybe, every cloud a possible threat. The men started talking to the sky like it could hear them. Some prayed, some cursed, some just stared. There's a strange dignity in that kind of service, the kind that doesn't make it into textbooks or documentaries. The world remembers Normandy, Sicily, Berlin, but it forgets Halifax, Vancouver, St. John's. Places that never saw battle yet were fortified like fortresses. Those men kept their watch just the same, and when peace came, their legacy was quiet. Maybe that's why it moves me so much to see those old guns reborn as playthings. They've gone from symbols of fear to symbols of peace without ever firing a shot. That's the kind of irony life saves for those who survive long enough to notice it. I've visited a few of those parks over the years. The metal still holds the shape of purpose, even under bright coats of paint. Mothers sit nearby on benches, watching their children play, unaware that the same ground once trembled under drills and commands. The guns remain, softened, tamed, forgiven. They hold laughter now, not shells. Sometimes I wonder if they feel it, if steel can feel at all. Maybe in some way it can. Maybe those machines understand they finally served their real purpose, to protect life, not destroy it. I can't say if that's redemption or just another kind of duty, but it feels right. War doesn't end when the treaties are signed. It lingers in memory, in soil, in the rusting remains of what we built to survive. But seeing those old anti-aircraft mounts turned into places of joy, that's a kind of peace no general could ever plan. It's proof that even the ugliest tools of war can be reshaped by time, by forgiveness, by innocence. And maybe that's the lesson buried beneath all this metal. The best victories aren't won through battle, but through transformation. Tell me in the comments, where are you watching this from? You can't really understand what waiting does to a man unless you've lived through it. Not the kind of waiting you do in a line, or for a letter from home, but the kind that stretches into months, then years, until you start to measure time not by days, but by drills and patrols. That's what Canada was during the war, a nation holding its breath. They called it readiness, but it was more like a long, shared silence that nobody knew how to break. The cities glowed under blackout, the coastlines were bristling with guns and radar towers, yet the sky remained empty. I used to watch the northern lights flicker above the frozen horizon, wondering if that's what incoming bombers might look like, a dance of fire, cold and distant, but they never came. The war that had turned Europe into hell barely brushed the Canadian coast, and yet the fear hung in the air like fog. It made the people quieter, humbler, more aware of every sound, every gust of wind that carried across the empty fields. After the war, I came back through those same ports, but they felt different. The air smelled of sawdust instead of diesel, the docks were filled with lumber instead of munitions, and the guns that once pointed skyward had been covered in rust. Some were dismantled for scrap, others simply left behind, and a few, just a few, were turned into something entirely new. When I first heard about the idea of turning old anti-aircraft guns into playgrounds, I thought it was a joke. The same weapons that had been meant to tear the sky apart, now painted bright and planted in parks where kids could climb and laugh. It felt absurd, but when I saw it for myself, those guns stripped of their shells, painted yellow and blue, children crawling over them like explorers, it hit me. Canada had done something the rest of us were too afraid to try. They didn't just bury the war, they transformed it. I remember standing in a small town outside of Ottawa, watching a group of kids running around what had once been a 40mm Bofors mount. Their hands gripped the cold metal of a barrel that had never fired a shot in anger. The same mount that had once been a symbol of vigilance now stood as a monument to peace. It wasn't fenced off or guarded. It was part of their everyday life, something they could touch, climb, and conquer without fear. I could hear their laughter echoing across the empty lot, the sound bouncing off the same concrete that had once held men with helmets and rifles. And I thought to myself, maybe this is how war should end. Not with parades, not with medals or speeches, but with the sound of children reclaiming what fear once owned. That's the thing about Canada. Its war stories aren't always about blood or battle. They're about endurance, patience, and the quiet kind of bravery that doesn't need to be seen. The men stationed on those coasts didn't fire their guns, but they stayed ready, day after day, through blizzards and endless drills, through rumors of enemy sightings that never came true. Their fight was against doubt, against the creeping thought that maybe all this effort was for nothing. And yet, when the war ended, their readiness became something beautiful. The same discipline that once fueled their vigilance now fueled rebuilding. The same hands that cleaned guns began hammering nails, laying bricks, and painting playground. The spirit of defense turned into the spirit of creation. Every veteran I've spoken to from that time says the same thing. They didn't want to see another weapon again. They wanted peace so badly it hurt, but the world doesn't let go of its steel that easily. It lingers. So maybe turning those guns into something harmless was the only way to finally let go. I think of it as a kind of alchemy, the transformation of fear into freedom. There's a strange poetry in it too. Those guns, designed to protect children from bombs, ended up protecting them from boredom. They became part of the landscape, part of memory, part of a promise that what was built for war could serve peace. When you walk through those parks today, most people don't even know what they're standing on. They don't realize that the slides and swings were once instruments of defense, that the smooth steel their kids touch once carried the weight of war. But maybe that's how it should be. Maybe the best kind of peace is the one that erases the need to remember what came before. I stood there, an old soldier, surrounded by children, and for the first time in a long time, I felt something I hadn't felt during the war, quiet pride. Not the kind you get from victory, but the kind that comes from knowing the world has moved on, that the fear that once defined you has been replaced by joy. Canada didn't win its war with gunfire, it won it with patience. And maybe that's why its transformation feels so pure, because even when the world was at its darkest, They built in silence, prepared in hope, and when the light returned, they didn't celebrate destruction, they celebrated life. Maybe that's the lesson we all missed. If you're hearing this and it makes you think about what it means to rebuild, to turn something painful into something peaceful, then you understand. Subscribe to keep these memories alive, because stories like this remind us that even the tools of war can be rewritten by the hands of peace. I remember the first time I saw real combat overseas, and it felt like a different universe from the cold stillness of those Canadian outposts. In Europe, the air itself seemed to vibrate with fear. Every sound sharper, every smell burned into your lungs. You didn't have time to think, only to react. I'd spent months beside those silent Beauforts, watching skies that stayed empty, and now I was looking at skies filled with fire. The contrast was unbearable. The men I met there, from the same northern towns that had built their walls of steel against invisible enemies, fought with a kind of precision born from patience. They weren't reckless like some of the younger recruits who'd come straight from the cities. They were steady, calm, the kind of men who could load a gun with frozen hands and never miss a beat. They'd been trained by years of waiting for a threat that never arrived, and when it finally did, on another continent, they knew exactly what to do. That's the thing about vigilance. It's a kind of muscle memory, even when it's born from silence. The skies over Europe were never empty. We lived beneath a constant hum, a mechanical storm of propellers and distant thunder. The smell of cordite clung to everything, your clothes, your hair, your soul. Sometimes at night, between raids, I'd think back to those quiet watch stations in Canada and almost envy them. I used to picture those empty guns sitting in the snow, unmanned, forgotten, while I crouched in mud and rubble. I'd imagine a single snowflake landing on a barrel that had never fired, melting slowly into a bead of water that slid down into the steel. There was something sacred in that stillness, something almost merciful. When I finally came home, I went north again, not to visit comrades, but to see those guns. I needed to know they were still there, still untouched by the fire that had consumed so much of the world. I found one outside Halifax, half sunk in the ground, its base surrounded by weeds. The barrel was still pointed at the sky, defiant, like it hadn't yet been told the war was over. I brushed my hand across the cold metal and felt a jolt of memory. The drills, the endless scanning of the horizon, the whisper of the sergeant's voice behind me. Then I looked closer and saw something painted on the side, children's name, written in chalk. The town had turned it into part of a playground. The gun I'd once cleaned, loaded, and trained on invisible bombers was now covered in doodles, stars, hearts, stick figures with smiling faces. For a long time, I couldn't move. The world felt quiet again, the same kind of quiet I remembered before the first shots were fired. It was like time had folded in on itself, bringing everything full circle. That image never left me. It's what peace should look like, innocence reclaiming what fear once owned. Those kids had no idea what that thing was, and that's exactly what made it beautiful. They weren't scared of it. They weren't burdened by its history. They'd conquered it in the only way that mattered, by forgetting. The laughter of children is the only sound that can truly drown out war. I think that's why Canada's story sticks with me more than most. They prepared for hell and got silence, and somehow that silence became a gift. Every unused bullet, every unlaunched shell was a seed for a better world. When you think about it, turning those guns into playgrounds wasn't just recycling metal, it was rewriting destiny. Years later, I visited Europe again. Some of the old battlefields had been turned into museums, others into cemeteries, but I never saw anything quite like what Canada did. In France, they fenced the old artillery behind ropes and plaques, "Do not touch." In Germany, they buried theirs. In England, they displayed them like relics. Only Canada turned them into something alive. I asked an old Canadian engineer once why they did it. He smiled and said, "Because the best way to beat war is to make it forgettable." At the time, I didn't understand, but I do now. When a weapon becomes a toy, when a killing machine becomes a monument to laughter, the cycle ends there. No revenge, no pride, just life continuing. And maybe that's the deeper truth buried in all this steel and paint. The world doesn't need more heroes. It needs people willing to turn fear into joy, metal into motion, memory into play. Maybe that's what those quiet years of vigilance were for. Maybe the waiting wasn't wasted after all. It taught them patience, and patience is what peace demands. The war may have skipped their skies, but it left them something far more valuable. The wisdom to know that victory isn't in destruction. It's in what you choose to build when the silence returns. So tell me something, and be honest. If you had the chance to turn your worst memory into something beautiful, would you do it? Or would you keep it locked away, afraid to see what it could become? Type this in the comments. I'd turn my pain into something good. When the war ended, it didn't end all at once. People like to think of peace as a switch being flipped. Guns silent, flags raised, soldiers hugging in the streets. But it doesn't work that way. The noise fades slowly, like a wound closing over months, not moments. For a long time after coming home, I couldn't sleep in silence. The absence of sound felt unnatural, almost hostile. In Europe, even when things were quiet, there was always something. The wind moving through broken glass, the distant echo of trucks, the whisper of boots on gravel. Back in Canada, there was only stillness, a silence so deep it made your ears ring. I'd walk down the streets of towns that had been darkened for years by blackout curtains, and they were bright again. Neon signs, laughter spilling from bars, the smell of bread and gasoline and new beginnings. Yet every time I passed one of those old anti-aircraft mounts, now rusting in the grass or painted for children, a part of me tightened. It was like seeing an old comrade in a hospital, alive, but changed. I started noticing them everywhere, in small towns and harbour cities. Guns stripped of their barrels, welded into abstract sculptures, or turned into benches near the waterfront. Some were almost unrecognizable under the bright paint. Reds, yellows, sky blues that tried to erase the grey of memory. I'd see kids hanging from the handles that used to aim the barrels, laughing as they swung back and forth. One of them yelled, "Bang!" as he jumped off, pretending to fire. I stood there frozen, caught between heartbreak and gratitude. That word, that sound, once it meant death. Now it was part of a game. It's hard to describe the feeling, like watching a scar fade, even though you can still feel it itching beneath the skin. I remember one afternoon in particular, out near Victoria, on Vancouver Island. There was a park that used to be an old coastal defence site, built to protect the straits from possible invasion. The emplacement was still there, the same ring of concrete where gunners once stood scanning the horizon for ships that never came. But the gun itself had been painted bright blue, the kind of blue that only belongs to playgrounds and summer skies. A mother was sitting on a bench nearby, watching her daughter climb the barrel. She had pigtails and a pink coat, and she laughed every time she slid down. I asked the mother if she knew what that thing used to be. She smiled politely and said, "Something from the war, I think." Then she looked back at her child and said, "At least now it's good for something." Those words stayed with me. At least now it's good for something. Maybe that's the simplest truth about peace. It's not about erasing the past, but about making it finally mean something better. You see, every weapon holds a kind of memory, like it absorbs the intent of its builders. Those guns were made to protect, not destroy. They were defensive, watchful, patient. Maybe that's why Canada could transform them so easily. They were born from the instinct to guard life, not take it. There's something noble in that, even if no shots were ever fired. The fear that built them gave way to a calm of courage. And when the war ended, that same courage flowed into the rebuilding of community. The men who once tightened those bolts and sighted those barrels became fathers, builders, teachers. They carried the discipline of war into the rhythm of peace. That's why Canada's cities didn't just grow after the war. They healed. I spent years haunted by the thought of what might have been. If the bombers had come, if the coast had burned, if those guns had fired, would those same parks even exist today? Probably not. The absence of war became its own kind of victory, one that no one could march for. It's the hardest kind of heroism to recognize, the kind defined by what didn't happen. The soldiers who waited, the guns that never spoke, the towns that stayed whole. They'll never have parades or statues, but maybe they don't need them. The laughter of children on those playgrounds is memorial enough. Every giggle, every shout, every small hand gripping the barrel of what was once a weapon. That's history rewriting itself in real time. And when I see it now, I realize something I didn't back then. War ends not when the fighting stops, but when we stop needing the memory of it to define us. Those playgrounds are proof. They show that a nation once ready for the worst learned to build a life from its own restraint. Canada's guns never had to roar because its courage was quiet. Maybe that's the truest kind of strength, to hold fire and never use it, to prepare for darkness and still choose light. I walk through those parks sometimes, watching the kids run across the grass, their laughter mixing with the wind, and I think, this is what peace sounds like. It doesn't cheer, it doesn't parade, it doesn't boast. It simply exists, steady and alive, in the sound of children playing on what was once meant to defend them. If you've ever seen something broken turned into something beautiful, you understand. Hit that like button and subscribe, because stories like this remind us that even after war, the world can still learn how to laugh again. I went back to Europe in '59, long after the war, long after the medals had lost their shine, and the uniforms had become too small for the men who once wore them. I didn't go back for honor or nostalgia. I went because I couldn't stop thinking about what had been left behind. France, Belgium, Germany. The names were familiar, but the faces of the land had changed. The rubble was gone, replaced by cafes and gardens. And where we once crawled through mud, children now played soccer. It was strange, almost unsettling, to see so much life growing out of places that had been nothing but ash. But that's how time works. It doesn't ask for permission to move on, it just does. Still, something about it felt incomplete. The people rebuilt their homes, their streets, their cities, but you could still feel the ghosts beneath it all, like the ground itself remembered what it had seen. That's when I realized how rare Canada's story really was. They had built their monuments to peace during peace, not after the ruins were cleared. They hadn't needed to rise from ashes. They'd grown from patience. I traveled for weeks, visiting old airfields and harbors, trying to trace what became of the old Beauforts and Oerlikon. Most of them had been melted down, repurposed into bridges, ships, even factory frames. But here and there, I'd find one left behind, silent, proud, almost forgotten. In a small town near Quebec City, there was a playground where one of those guns stood like a strange centerpiece. The paint had faded, but the mount was still sturdy, the steel refusing to give up. I sat nearby on a bench, just watching the children play. They swung from the levers, climbed up the barrel, spinning the cranks as if commanding their own invisible fleets. None of them knew the history beneath their hands. To them, it was just part of the playground, another toy in a world that had always known peace. I wanted to tell them what that thing had once meant, to explain that it had been built to shoot down planes, to save lives that were never in danger, but I didn't. I stayed quiet. Maybe because I knew they didn't need that story. Maybe because that was the whole point. The beauty of it was in the forgetting. That's something people like us, veterans, survivors, struggle to understand. We remember everything too well. The smell of oil, the taste of rations, the sound of boots in mud. We live with those echoes long after the world has stopped listening. But watching those children, I understood something new. Forgetting is another kind of victory. It means the world doesn't need to keep carrying the weight we once bore. It means the fear that built those guns had finally dissolved. Maybe peace isn't built on memory. It's built on amnesia, on the ability to live without looking over your shoulder. I stayed in that town for a few days. One morning, an old man joined me on the bench. He must have been local. He wore a thick wool coat and smelled of pipe tobacco. He told me he'd served in the Home Guard, stationed just a few miles from there during the war. He'd manned one of those same guns. Never fired it once, he said with a quiet smile. Closest we came was shooting at seagulls when the boys got bored. He laughed softly, then looked at the playground. Funny thing, eh? I trained to protect this place, and now it's protecting my grandkids. I asked him how he felt about seeing it turned into a toy. He shrugged. Better this than rust. That stuck with me. Better this than rust. That's what peace should be. A transformation, not an erasure, not denial, not decoration. Just something new built from what almost destroyed us. As I traveled west, I found more examples, parks, memorials, strange hybrids of the past and present. Some towns had turned their gun mounts into flower beds, filling the barrels with soil and wildflowers. Others had left them intact, letting vines crawl up their sides until nature claimed them completely. In Vancouver, I found one standing at the edge of a park, untouched, with a plaque that read, "This gun never fired a shot in anger." It was the simplest line I'd ever read, and somehow the most profound. It was a reminder that not all courage is measured by battle. Sometimes it's measured by restraint, by the strength it takes to stay ready, but not strike. I walked around that gun for a long time, tracing my hand over the metal, feeling the texture of time under my fingertips. The edges were smoother now, worn down by years of weather and curious hands. I thought about how many storms it had outlasted, literal and otherwise, the wars that followed, the fears that came and went. And still it stood there, quiet, a relic that no longer frightened anyone. I think that's when I truly understood what Canada had given to the world. Not just soldiers or supplies or alliances, but an example, a lesson in how to live after fear. We talk a lot about courage in battle, but there's another kind of courage most people never see. The courage to prepare for a fight that never comes, to stay awake when the rest of the world sleeps, guarding against ghosts. That's what those Canadian gunners did. That's what those guns symbolized. And maybe that's why they were so easy to turn into playgrounds. They were never stained by blood. never haunted by scream. They carried only anticipation, only readiness. Turning them into something innocent wasn't defiance, it was completion. It was their true purpose, finally realized. So when people ask me what peace looks like, I tell them it looks like a child climbing a cannon that never fired. It sounds like laughter echoing through steel once meant to destroy. It feels like cold metal warmed by sunlight and small hands. That's peace, not silence, but transformation. And I'll ask you now, the same way I asked myself that, what do you do with the things in your life that were built for defense? Do you keep them aimed at the horizon, waiting for ghosts that never come? Or do you turn them into something that makes others smile? Type this in the comments. I'd rather build than guard. There's a certain peace that only comes with age, a quiet that settles not because you found answers, but because you finally stopped asking the wrong questions. I used to think the war defined me, the training, the fear, the years spent waiting for death or glory, whichever arrived first. But standing in those parks, seeing what the world did with the remnants of our readiness, I realized I'd misunderstood what survival really means. It's not about who comes home. It's about what you do with the life that's left. The men I knew back then, the ones who kept watch over Canada's frozen coastline, they went home to farms, factories, schools. They never called themselves heroes because they never fired a shot. But I think now that maybe they were the purest kind. They stood ready in the dark, believing that any day could be their last. And when peace came instead, they didn't question it. They just picked up their lives and kept building. That's courage too, learning how to live without the constant hum of fear in your chest. Sometimes I visit those same coastal towns and wonder if anyone remembers what once stood there. Most of the gun emplacements are gone now, buried under parking lots or hidden by trees. But here and there, a few remain, their concrete circles cracked by roots and time. Kids ride their bikes through them, tossing pebbles into the rusted holes where bolts used to hold steel in place. To them, it's just a weird old ruin, nothing more. And that's good. The best kind of memorial isn't one that demands reverence. It's one that disappears into daily life, quietly shaping the world without needing to be seen. Those forgotten emplacements, those playground cannons, they're proof that peace doesn't need to shout to be real. It just needs to endure. One winter afternoon, I met a man who'd been a boy during the war. He lived near one of those coastal batteries, and he told me how the soldiers used to let him help polish the shells. They never told me what they were for, he said. They just said they were to keep us safe. He laughed when I told him those guns had never fired. Good, he said, means they did their job. That stuck with me. The idea that success could mean nothing happened, that all our drills, all our long cold nights staring into an empty sky, had done exactly what they were supposed to do, prevent the very thing we feared. It's hard for outsiders to understand that kind of victory. It doesn't come with parades or medals. It's invisible. But maybe that's what makes it sacred. When I look back on those years now, I don't see wasted time. I see preparation, not just for war, but for life. The patience we learned waiting for bombers that never came became the same patience that helped us rebuild afterward. The discipline of watchfulness turned into craftsmanship, fatherhood, teaching. The readiness became resilience. And the fear, it turned into gratitude. You can only appreciate quiet once you've lived through noise. You can only understand laughter once you've known the sound of orders barked through frozen air. Maybe that's why I love hearing children play near those old gun sites. It's not just joy, it's proof that we did something right, even if no one remembers our names. I've seen what happens when nations can't let go of their wars. I've walked through countries that still carry their scars like trophies, monuments that scream of victory but whisper of loss. Canada did something different. It turned its scars into playground. That's not weakness, it's wisdom. It's saying, we don't need to worship what could have been. We'll celebrate what never had to happen. There's a kind of moral strength in that, a quiet defiance that I think the rest of the world could learn from. They turned fear into function, steel into safety, memory into movement. They didn't erase their history, they repurposed it. That's what I wish every nation could do. The older I get, the more I believe that the greatest battles are the ones we never have to fight. We spend our youth believing that purpose comes from conflict, but maybe the real purpose lies in restraint, in holding your fire, in transforming the tools of defense into the tools of joy. Every time I see a child swing from the barrel of a cannon that never fired, I see the legacy of all the men who waited and never saw battle. Their watchfulness became that laughter, their silence became that peace. It's not dramatic, it's not cinematic, but it's real. Maybe that's why I keep telling these stories, even when my voice trembles and the memories blur, because someone has to remember the ones who stood guard against nothing, and kept the world safe through their patience alone. Someone has to remind the next generation that peace isn't passive. It's earned every day by the choice not to fight. If you believe that strength isn't just in winning wars, but in preventing them, leave a like and share this story. Because sometimes the greatest victories are the ones no one ever sees. I spent the next years chasing the sound of that laughter like it was a compass, leading me through a world that had learned to live again. Wherever I went, Toronto, Montreal, Winnipeg, I found traces of those old defenses, the ghosts of a war that never arrived. You could spot them if you knew what to look for. A concrete foundation hidden beneath grass, a mound too perfectly shaped to be natural, a plaque so worn it had lost its letters. Sometimes, if I stood still enough, I could almost hear the echoes of our boots, the faint rattle of tools, the cough of the diesel generators we used to curse in the freezing nights. Those places had a kind of sacred quiet to them, not mournful like a battlefield, but humbled, like they knew they'd been spared. I started photographing the old gun site, what was left of them anyway, not for history books, not for museums, just for myself. It became a kind of ritual. Every time I found one, I'd take a picture of whatever had grown there since. A tree breaking through concrete, a swing set beside a rusting mount, a couple walking their dog where once we'd stood ready to die. I called the collection Guns That Never Spoke. I never showed it to anyone. It felt too personal, too raw. Those images weren't about what we built, they were about what we didn't have to destroy. Every frame told the same quiet story. We prepared for the worst, and the world gave us peace instead. That's not failure, that's grace. Sometimes I wonder what those engineers thought when they designed those anti-aircraft guns, how focused they must have been, how sure they were that every bolt and bearing would someday matter. But war is strange that way. It gives meaning to things that shouldn't need it. We give machines purpose, and when the war ends, we have to find new ones, or else admit how much of our time was spent waiting for destruction. Maybe that's why the idea of turning those guns into playgrounds caught on so easily. It gave purpose back to the purposeless. Steel isn't sentimental. It doesn't care what it was made for. It just obeys whoever holds the wrench. We built instruments of death, and then, in an act of collective forgiveness, we turned them into instruments of play. That's the closest thing to redemption I've ever seen. In one town outside Calgary, an old veteran recognized me when I stopped by the local cafe. He'd served in the same division, stationed miles inland, where they'd guarded railways instead of skies. We talked for hours, swapping stories, until he said something that stuck in my bones. You know, he told me, those guns. We thought they were useless when no planes came, but maybe they scared the enemy off. Maybe they did their job by existing. He was right. Deterrence is invisible. Success is silence. The absence of bombs, the quiet hum of safety, that's victory, even if nobody cheers for it. And maybe that's why their afterlife fits so perfectly. What better way to honor a weapon that never needed to be fired than to turn it into something joyful? It's like life itself chose mercy over memory, but there's a shadow to it too. Every time I see one of those playgrounds, part of me still feels that old weight in my chest, the one that comes from expecting death and finding only quiet. That kind of vigilance never leaves you. You carry it into every day, into every calm moment, waiting for it to break. That's what the war left us with, a generation of men who had to learn how to live when the danger never arrived. We trained our minds to expect chaos, and when it didn't come, it left a hole. Some filled it with work, others with drink, others with silence. I filled mine with stories. Maybe that's why I'm still here, talking to whoever's listening, because silence deserves to be remembered too. Once, in a park near the coast, I watched a little boy climb onto one of those old gun mounts. His father, about my grandson's age, lifted him up and told him to steer the spaceship. The kid grinned, spinning the wheel and shouting, "Pew pew." The father laughed, took a picture, and they walked away. I stayed behind. The wind off the ocean carried the smell of salt and rust. I put my hand on the mount, cold beneath the paint, and I thought about the men who'd once stood there, and about all the enemies who never came. The world had turned that steel into a toy, but I could still feel its heartbeat, the tension, the purpose, the watchfulness. It was still guarding something, in its own way. Only now, it was guarding innocence. And that, I think, is what peace truly means. Not forgetting the past, but reshaping it so it can hold life instead of fear. That's what I want people to understand. These aren't just stories about guns or war. They're about transformation, about how even the coldest, hardest things we make can change meaning if we're brave enough to let them. A gun turned into a jungle gym isn't just a curiosity, it's a message. It says that fear doesn't have to last forever, that even the tools built for death can cradle life if we give them the chance. So I'll ask you, the same way I ask myself every time I stand in one of those parks, what in your life could be turned from steel into laughter? What could you repurpose, not erase, but transform? Because that's where peace begins. Type this in the comments so I know you're still here, still listening. Even steel can change.